the benefits of AWS security and also talk about what security means on AWS and how can we implement security on AWS as well. Quick introduction, Joe Holbrook. I've been in the technology sector for quite a while, over 20 plus years. I've been based for the last 4 or 5 years out of Jacksonville, Florida. I have had the opportunity to live in San Jose and Boston and DC and other locations as well. But basically, I've done quite a bit in cloud computing as well as blockchain as well. And I'm also a veteran as well in the Navy. But with that said, let's talk about what we're going to understand. We want to understand the AWS security model. And it's important that we understand what the model is before we deploy our cloud services. And one of the things that generally comes into play here is that with the shared security model, the provider is going to handle a lot of areas of focus for you, such as the hardware, the software, the security access, etc. But your job as a customer is to handle what? Your account, your virtual machine, your OSs, your data. And I'll talk more about that. And then we'll talk about security services on AWS as well. And what are those security services that you may want to consider, like CloudTrail perhaps, or IAM. We'll talk about best practices as well. And then I'm going to talk to you about the top 7 security services on AWS you should be using today in your environments. Then lastly, I'll talk about the AWS Security Specialty Cert for those that are interested. And then we'll put it all together. Before we start out, did you know that in a recent study that ThreatStack found that 73% of companies had at least one critical security misconfig, such as remote SSH, open to the entire internet? And I'll talk about ways we could mitigate those issues. Also, when it comes to security incidents, we want to be aware that, again, it's all about managing your incidents. And it's one thing, for example, to have an incident, but it's another thing to actually handle it appropriately. AWS S3. Now, one of the challenges that I ran into actually a few times with some customers is that they didn't really realize that their AWS S3 bucket was something that someone could guess. That there's actually utilities out there that you could find on the dark web to basically go out and start guessing AWS S3 bucket names and then run attacks against them. And what we want to be aware of is that if an attacker figures this out, then they can steal your data and expose it to views that are unintended. Now, this happened to a couple defense contractors who had National Security Agency information on it in the US. And this happened as well to some companies as well. I don't remember the companies off my head, but there are large Fortune 100 companies. So we have to be aware that S3 is a huge weakness, and it's even a bigger weakness when we don't have properly trained people actually dealing with the S3 configs. Also, VPC log entries, we can scan those. So if we're not scanning our flow logs, then we are essentially letting the attacker stay in and have a good time searching around. Let's talk about the concept of shared security. Now, when it comes to the concept of shared security, again, over on the left, we have the customer at the top, and at the bottom, we have AWS. For example, the customer is going to handle your data. In other words, if you're a customer of AWS, you're going to have to handle your own data. You have to export it and import it into the cloud. And we want to do that as securely and efficiently as possible. Now, when it comes to handling the operating systems, the network and firewalls, this is our job as well. AWS, for example, though, handles the compute, the storage, the databases, the networking from generally below the hypervisor level when we're talking about compute. They also maintain their own data center infrastructure and availability of the regions as well. Now, again, there's a whole white paper that is available online for those interested about the AWS security model. Let's talk about some best practices. And we'll go to a demo here shortly as well. Now, when it comes to Amazon Web Services, we want to be aware that we really should rotate our keys. So if we're using a key manager, we want to have those policies in place. This is no different than if we deployed an AWS, Azure, or on-prem, or Google, or whatever we're using. The second best practice, again, true for so many scenarios here, is the principle of least privilege. Now, for those not familiar with the principle of least privilege, what this means is this. If you have a database administrator that's using SQL and they only use SQL, then you don't need to give them access to other VMs and other databases. In other words, if that's the only access they need, they only get that level of access. So if they need access to be able to deploy a database, a SQL instance, let's say, that's all they need, then that's all the access we should give them. Now, AWS has this really cool tool called Trusted Advisor. Now, there's a couple different approaches on how it's deployed. Again, it's built into AWS. There's free parts of Trusted Advisor, and there's paid for. Depends on your support level and the amount of access that you would receive. And then auditing. When it comes to auditing, we want to be aware of the fact that we really need to review what is going on in our cloud. So we need to, for example, deploy our applications in the cloud and then sample our logs and basically try to run some kind of compliance or audit process to determine if we're meeting all the requirements of our compliance requirements, whatever they are, HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley or ISO, whatever those requirements are, we need to validate that we are in spec, whatever that is. But also when we perform auditing, what auditing does is it also validates that we've met best practices. And assuming we met best practices, we've reduced our footprint of basically possible security vulnerabilities. Patching. Now, contrary to popular belief, the cloud provider does not patch your virtual machines. What they do though is they patch the firmware of the servers that they're running on and the hypervisor if needed. They don't patch Windows operating system patches. They do not patch Linux. That's up to you to maintain the patch level in AWS. So just be aware of that. Now, there are some platforms as a service that'll handle that as well. But again, this is up to you to validate what is handled by the provider and what is not. When it comes to root accounts. Now, what is a root account? The root account is what? That's the keys to the kingdom, right? We don't want to set up everybody as having access to the root account. We only need to have 1 or 2 administrators with root access. At least we should. Now, again, maybe you have a larger company and we want to give 4 or 5 people root access. But in general, root access should be extremely limited. And what we want to do is create administrator roles, basically, whatever the administrator role is. Commonly, I like to create an admin role based on what the job duty is. So if it's a database administrator, I like to create a role called DB admin. And they only have access to deploy DBs that they need to. Or if it's a virtual machine administrator, a VM admin, I try to make it obvious as part of that process so that a VM admin only has access to EC2, for example. And then if they're going to use EBS, then maybe we add that to the role. Multi-factor authentication. Now, MFA, again, is enforced as well. Now, multi-factor authentication, we want to be able to deploy our basically basically let's clarify a few things, because the way I wrote this, I probably wanted to write a little better, but basically here's sort of the thought. So when we consider multi-factor authentication, now remember, multi-factor authentication is where we have at least 2 ways to authenticate. In other words, generally, like, for example, we have a password and then maybe a token. Again, that's multi-factor authentication. So we want to, basically, we want to ensure that MFA is implemented appropriately and enforced appropriately. So that's sort of the way I would want to state that. A little bit clearer, I guess. Now, let's go to some demos. And then what I want to do too is get back over to some more best practices. So let's talk about Trusted Advisor. Now, what we want to do is go over to Trusted Advisor, and this is one of those tools in AWS that we absolutely have to use. Now, not only does Trusted Advisor provide us great benefits around cost optimization, performance, but also security. When I click on security, it's going to do some security checks. Now, we have additional recommendations we could use as well if we want to go to a different level of support. So like I was saying, if we want to go from a basic plan support or developer to basically business or enterprise, we would get additional support and reports as well as part of our dashboard. So that is the support plan. This is how Trusted Advisor works. But even if you don't have enterprise support, this provides some really nice benefits. For example, it's saying you really should implement multi-factor authentication. And what it does is it tells you where to go to find out more about AWS multi-factor authentication, IAM. Now, what's nice is when you refresh this, it actually refreshes automatically. So after you make a change, this will change as well, IAM. Now, it says that RDS, EBS, S3 is fine. And again, that's because I don't have anything deployed. But down here, security groups, it says basically no security groups allow unrestricted access to a security port, to a specific port. And again, this is good because, again, we don't want to deploy a security group that just says go anywhere you want in the security group or to any port. It's not, that's a no-no. So this is, again, one tool that we could use. Now, for the purposes of this webinar, I won't talk much more about the other features of Trusted Advisor, but what we want to do, of course, is go over to EC2 And when we're setting up EC2, we want to be aware of how we deploy our resources. So we need to create, basically over here, security groups. But before we do that, we may want to deploy a VPC or figure out our network structure. So if we create a security group, you can see that I have a security group called QuickStart Security Group 1. And again, I could go over here and allow SSH access and HTTPS access. However, I'm allowing all traffic to go out. Now again, we want to create our inbound rules to protect our virtual machines. So if I go over here to my whiteboard, and I want to, oops, let me change my, if I go over here to my whiteboard and I want to deploy resources, let's say I'm on-prem, and then this is AWS, and let's say as part of my cloud structure, I have AWS deployed in US East 1 and then Central. So let's say Iowa, I'm in the Iowa region. I think it's Iowa. That's how you spell Iowa, yep. And then let's say I'm in Northern Virginia. I'll just say NVA. Now, what I want to consider is how do I deploy my networking services to AWS? But before I do that, what do I want to do here? I need to think about a few things. I may want to, let me go ahead and do a different diagram here, a different figure. I may want to deploy what's called a virtual private network, or I may want to use Direct Connect. And so, for example, I may want to have a point-to-point connection. And if I do that, then I shouldn't need to have a VPN. But if I don't have a private connection from on-prem to AWS, then I want to have a VPN. This VPN would be a gateway to gateway VPN. Now, what about if I have a bunch of developers that want to access my AWS resources here? What do we want to do? Well, the first thing is we generally want to keep developers in line. Now, developers generally are very playful types. And what I mean by that is this. They like to test and experiment, and that's their job, right? They're meant to develop, and as part of development, they got to try things out and see how things work. But because of that, we need to make sure that our developers access resources in an appropriate manner. So for example, if I have VMs located in Northern Virginia and in Iowa, we need to have a way to mitigate SSH, which is going to be for what? SSH is going to go from on-prem to our resources in the cloud. So what do we want to do here? I want to deploy basically a bastion host. This is the best practice. We want to have our developers go to a bastion host for ingress. But what about if we want to have applications, for example, let me change my color. Let's say I want this virtual machine deployed, and on this virtual machine I have big data services that need to access the internet, and they need to go out, and let's say they need to find a stock ticker price or whatever that is. Maybe it's a simple web script that we're running in a function as a service or whatever in AWS, like Lambda, and it's just going out and it's kicking off a process that kicks off a Lambda service, and goes out and pulls snippets of information and brings it into AWS. Well, we don't want to have our IP space basically disclosed to the world when we go over the public internet. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we probably want to deploy what's called a NAT service, or a network address translation service. Again, simple enough. So as a best practice, we absolutely have to think about how we deploy resources on the cloud provider, but also we want to understand that we could also use, for example, some of the services we're already using on AWS. For example, if you're already using firewalls from Palo Alto, you could use those in AWS if you want. If you're using Docker containers, you can deploy them in AWS. So again, we may want to do some things on-prem. We may not want to do everything on-prem. That's up to us. So for example, Docker, we may want to use marketplace solutions, for example. And again, we could do this a few different ways. We could basically move our containers over to the marketplace if we want. We could use our firewall, use it in the marketplace on AWS. It's really our call. Now, a security group is a way, for example, for us to deploy basically a firewall in our virtual machine environment. Now, a security group, again, I sort of showed you that briefly, where we could specify the ports that we want to leave open and the ports that we don't as well. So what we want to do is make sure if we don't need to have SSH open, then don't leave it open. If we don't want, for example, administrators, for example, accessing SSH directly, we need to open up a Bastion host and have them, just like I showed you on the diagram, go, instead of going directly to the VM, go directly to the jump host is another way to look at it, and access the cloud services that way. Now, what about S3 buckets? Okay, this is where some companies have absolutely got into trouble with S3 buckets. We don't want to leave a bucket open to the public with any kind of personal information in it. It's an absolute no-no. And I'll show you that in a second. Now let's talk about security groups. Now, one of the things I want to pay attention to before I go to the demo again is just be aware too that with AWS, we want to create security groups based on the risk that we're trying to mitigate. We don't want to create a security group and put every resource in it. We want to create a security group based on the use case is another way I like to look at it. So let's go over to the demo and talk about security groups. Now, in the security group, we want to be aware that we need to add inbound and outbound rules. So let's cancel that. And if you scroll, if you could see down here, I have basically SSH and HTTPS open. Outbound, I have all traffic open. Now I could edit this and turn it off if I want. I could create another security group and call it QuickStart SG number 2 and say this is for VMs. And then what I want to do now is I have to add my rules. So basically I need to open, sorry about the email, I need to open ports. So what I want to do is select, again, this is where we have to know our use case for, let me close that. Sorry about that. Okay. Now, this is where we need to know our use case. So if I go back here to my diagram, I need to create security groups based on the VM use cases in a lot of cases. So, for example, maybe this is where the developers access, and this is where I'm hosting my production apps. In that case, what do I want to do? I want to go over here and maybe allow developers to access via SSH. And I add that rule. And then let's say, for example, I want, for example, the ability for developers to send emails from their VMs. Then if that's the case, maybe we want POP3, so on and so on. And again, these are just some of the things. Now, outbound, by default, it's all traffic. If I don't want that, I need to say, for example, no traffic, or I need to basically select custom rules here, or I just want SSH to go out, whatever that use case is. So that's really how you create a security group. So think of a security group as a way to filter your traffic, to firewall your traffic. And again, it's fairly straightforward in that respect. Now, I could also add tags. So for example, I could add a tag that says, for example, in this case, a key and a value. For example, these VMs, let's say, are for production. So what I want to do is say production as a key and then assign a value. Maybe these VMs are a certain use case or a certain, for example, deployment type. I don't know, maybe they're small VMs, large VMs. Maybe there's a certain AMI, which is an Amazon Machine Image. Whatever that value is, I could say 22, whatever. Basically, we want to create basically what's called a key value pair, where we create a name and a value, in this case, whatever it is. So for example, production, this might be for WordPress. A lot of people deploy WordPress on AWS. And again, maybe that says this is production WordPress. Then I go save. So that tag is going to help me later identify traffic in this security group. And what I want to do is ensure that I could log that, filter that, monitor that. I could go over here, for example, and go back to services, say CloudWatch. And when I type in cloud, you can see that there's different cloud services, but CloudWatch is a monitoring management service in AWS. I could set up, for example, different resource groups. I could create rules. I could also, one of the things you want to do too is create a dashboard. I won't get into too much of the monitoring here, but if I do, now there is a monitoring AWS course that I have on QuickStart. If that's of interest, I go through how to create alerts and metrics and everything on CloudWatch. So if that's of interest, go to quickstart.com and search for AWS monitoring. There's a course that goes through that. Now, alarms. I could go through and create alarms. So for example, if I go in and create an alarm here, I select the metrics. I could select the source, let's say EC2. I could select everything on that VM or that instance, or just specific metrics that I want. So it's up to me to select that. Now, again, I have to deploy a VM and select it for that to pick it up. So again, if I go back here, I go to EC2. There is one running VM. And I go here to monitoring, and you can see that by default, CloudWatch will provide you free information on some of the variables like CPU utilization, but if I need anything more like detailed, it's called, you get basic for free, but detailed monitoring is going to entail additional costs. Again, I walk you through that through the course. So that is monitoring. Now let's talk about CloudTrail. Now I'm going to talk about CloudTrail here in a second. And this is really meant for you as an organization to manage events. And I could, and this plays into compliance as well. This allows me to monitor and send myself basically information about something that's going on in my cloud service. So this is like a trigger service where we could create basically alerts. It's in AWS, it's called a trail. So workflow is similar to a trail. I'm going to basically select the data events. I need to select a bucket if I'm going to use S3, or I could use Lambda and then log it on a function as well. And if I go here, I call this the QuickStart demo. I could apply it to one region or all regions, whatever I want. Now, what it's going to do is, again, it's going to pick up my region right here. I'm in Northern Virginia. And again, this is one of the services where I could select multiple regions. It's up to me. A lot of the services like EC2, I got to specify the region I deploy it in. This can be confusing to people sometimes. And then again, I could add the bucket. Again, read and write. So I add an S3 bucket if I want. Add a prefix, and then I can create a new bucket as well, storage location. It's here. I'm going to call it and I already, I'll just call that 1, 2. And also to S3, for those folks not aware, it's basically a global namespace. And again, I go create. This will go ahead and create that trail. And it will read and write all events that are occurring. Now, you don't want to really normally do that in real life. You want to minimize all the messaging that you're going to get as part of this. So for example, if someone writes to S3, dumps data in S3, you'll get notified. So that's CloudTrail as well. SSL certificates. Now, one of the things I want to be aware of is CloudFront. Now, CloudFront is basically a way that we could cache our content basically at the edge locations that it's supported. Now, CloudFront is going to provide, again, some performance benefits to our user base in most cases. However, one of the challenges with CloudFront is people forget to maintain those certificates. Certificates can be deployed and they expire after typically whatever they're set at, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever, a year, whatever your policies are, you have to be aware of those. Why use services on AWS? Well, again, AWS, we know, automates a lot of their capabilities. They have managed services. They're considered pretty secure. AWS is built for scale. In other words, we could add on top of what we're doing anytime. Also, too, they have a large partner ecosystem. And I'll show you the marketplace as well, because one of the things that people forget is we could deploy a marketplace solution that can enable us to actually provide a higher level of service, a better ROI in what we're doing in some cases. And I'll explain how that works. And again, they have free and pay-as-you-go services. What are the top 7 AWS-related security services? Okay, AWS Security Hub, AWS Guard Duty, Cloud HSM, that is our basically security manager that we have, Amazon Inspector, Key Management Service, as well, KMS, Trusted Advisor, and CloudTrail we just went through. And we'll go ahead and talk about the Security Hub next, because I think this is a really nice feature that people just are not aware of. So let's go to the Security Hub. So before I get started, let me just type in here, and again, I know this is just released in like June. So this is again a nice service, and what Security Hub does is it allows you as an organization to prioritize security alerts and compliance status. Now, this is similar, if you're familiar with Azure, this is very similar to AWS Security Hub or Security Central. For example, over here, let me go over to Azure. I just want to show you a comparison. If I have it up, I thought I did. Oh, here it is. Over here, we have, for example, Security Center. And now, I'll be honest, the Azure Security Center is somewhat more robust than Security Hub. But again, we could go view policies, look at our security posture, look at threats, and it works similar to what Azure does, but it's not as mature. So just be aware of that. You could start a free trial of this if you're interested. You just go here and you go to Security Hub. And now the way this is priced, I just want to pay attention. What it does is it does a few things. It's going to bring together Amazon Inspector, Amazon Guard Duty. So Guard Duty, for example, is going to be a tool that we could use to determine, for example, is there any kind of personal information exposed out there? Amazon Inspector is going to view data as well. It's sort of like a trace system in some respects. But again, it's going to bring together these tools and really enable you to basically put together best practices and respond to recommendations. Now again, it's not a one-size-fits-all in reality. So we have to enable permissions, you enable the hub, and you can see here when you deploy this, now this is going to take some time to fully update until you start configuring these services. Again, like I said, it's not like Azure Security Center where everything's done for you automatically. This here, you have to really set up and configure. Now over here, compliance standards. For example, this is the Center for Information Internet Security. And again, if I go here, this tells you the best practices that are part of the controls. This is what it's going to check against. Now, just be aware that this will eventually update when we start deploying additional services and all that. So it's not totally comprehensive. So if I go here to summary, like here, 42 non-compliant rules. If I scroll down here, it will eventually start pointing out areas of improvement. So it'll say, for example, make sure that you don't have port 3389 available for ingress to all ports. Now, in AWS, 0.0.0.0 is not a good thing. And this is saying from anywhere. We don't want to allow traffic from anywhere, right? So again, a lot of good things to consider with this. And again, I could view results. And again, not everything's, available yet. This will take time to get it to provide insight that you wanted to provide. So if I go to Insights, now this will take it could take an hour to 6 hours to start populating, so just be aware of that. And then findings, if we go down here, what'll happen is this will do the compliance check and it'll tell you what the issue is, what the resource is as well, and we'll start populating this. If I go to settings, I could add accounts as well, and then there's also scripts here that you configure from GitHub as well. And then if I go back to AWS, if I go to S3, you could see that that bucket created. And for example, if I go to permissions, I could block public address. This is, again, something we want to check. That's a best practice. If I go to edit, we want to block public address unless this is going to be open to the public. Again, one of the challenges I've seen before is people will create buckets and just dump stuff in the bucket and they don't pay attention. It's sort of like on your desktop. A lot of the applications are set up that way for a default bucket, and they might generate reports, they may generate error logs, they may generate other information, and it goes into a bucket or two, and that information is not properly vetted. We have to pay attention to our policies. And this is telling you that if you do this, everything is going to be blocked. And again, now there is no way that someone can hack into that bucket because it's turned off from the outside. The way this is going to be accessed is what? Via inside of AWS. Now again, it depends on your use case, what you're using S3 for. So again, a lot more to talk about, my friends. There's just so much more, but we're running out of time. And if you're taking the AWS or even want to consider the AWS Security Specialty exam, you would definitely want to consider focusing on best practices. Here's the domains that are covered. And also there is a course on QuickStart as well that will be available coming up shortly. If that's of interest, you may want to reach out to your rep on that as well. Now, this course, again, would go into passing the specialty exam. That's the goal of the course. So let's put it all together. But what we want to be aware of is with AWS, we could also use AWS services or on-prem services as part of our complementary setup in the cloud. Now, let's say you want to deploy security tools in AWS. You would go over here and you would set up a subscription for the marketplace. This is separate compared to your current subscription with AWS in the manner where a lot of these are going to be paid for differently and separately. For example, if I go down here, I could look for different vendors. I could look for operating systems. I could look for regions where stuff's deployed in. I could type in security. And this will bring up security products that I could deploy on AWS. Pretty cool. And again, a lot of things. So for example, a lot of customers like Palo Alto, they may want to deploy their firewall services in AWS. And you can deploy that on a Linux server, VM, you can do that however you want. And again, some other things here to consider as part of that. So there's a couple options for deploying Palo Alto network virtual machine firewalls. And there's the bring your own license. And then there's this one here where you get a free trial and your build basically $4,700 a month or so to use this template and have the license. Not exactly cheap, but cheaper than buying a Palo Alto firewall and setting it up in some cases. This tells you about the image and the AMI that's going to be deployed. Pricing is, again, dependent on the size of the VM you deploy. So again, annual versus hourly. If I use, for example, a different config, you could see that the pricing for the software stays the same, but the VM price goes up or down depending on the config. So with that said, that's one other option for deploying services in AWS.